The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Monday, December 23rd, 2019. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Guano Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we're nearing the end of the year and arguably the end of the decade. We've gotten a lot of emails about the question as to whether we are ending the decade or, in fact, the decade ends in 2021. Nevertheless, we have ended our work year. That's right. It's one of our famous best ofs. Why is it famous? Well, sometimes you convince yourself that things are famous, and that way you can justify taking a couple of days off for vacation. Because we're giving you something famous, more famous than the actual show itself, but rather a repeat of the show. Voted by you. I'm specifically talking about one person voted for this show, and you know who you are. And congratulations. Because today we have How to Hide an Empire, a history of the greater United States with Daniel Immerwahr. He is an associate professor of history at Northwestern University, and fascinating book about basically how an empire is hidden in some respects. I don't know how else. I don't want no spoiler alerts here. No spoiler alerts here. Michael's here with us in spirit, but not on microphone. Folks,
Andrew Yang of Show Plug.
There you go. I don't know what that means.
You don't know the Medicare joke?
No. The Medicare, I don't.
Medicare
for all joke. All right. There you go, folks. See that? We're already on vacation. See how loose we are? Folks, we're on vacation all this week, and I will tell you that I will probably hop on YouTube if any big news happens this week. Also, the AM Quickie is live. We're doing it. amquickie.com. Sign up there. This week, we're going to be a little loosey-goosey on it. I think we're going to try a couple of different things just because we don't have our normal production regimen, and we may spice some stuff up, and then when we come back in the new year, maybe we'll integrate some of what we use. Not sure. Really don't know. We're playing this all by the seat of our pants. Everyone in the office was pretty frazzled by the end of this year. I imagine you are as well. I hope you are taking some time for some self-care. In other words, if you are one of those people who drinks alcohol, that you're doing that, or if you like to exercise, God forbid, you're doing that as well. Whatever it takes. So enjoy this. We will have a show every day this week except for Christmas. Because, it's Christmas. And come on. So, How to Hide an Empire, a history of the greater United States with Daniel Immerwahr. Don't forget, you can support this show by becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. And we have Fun Have stuff. Don't know what it is. We got a whole cavalcade of Fun Have stuff that'll be happening. And are we going to make these freebies? Yeah, we probably should, right? Freebie Mondays. This is our Christmas and Hanukkah present to you. Oh, also, Happy Hanukkah, because last night was the first night of Hanukkah. So, all right, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, Daniel Immerwahr, and this was first from Tuesday, April 30th, 2019, How to Hide an Empire, a history of the greater United States. Daniel Immerwahr, author of How to Hide an Empire, a history of the greater United States. Daniel, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's just as an overview, this is almost like a geographic history of the empire of the United States. Why? What is it about knowing the geography as you track it over the course of a couple hundred years that is so important to our understanding of America as as an entity, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's right. I start the book with maps, and one of the reasons I do that is that, frankly, I think a lot of people in the United States and a lot of people outside of the United States don't really have an accurate map of the full borders of the country in their head. So, if you ask most people, what does the U.S. look like on a map? They call to mind that familiar shape, just the contiguous blob with Mexico and Canada on the north and south and the oceans on either side. But the thing is, those have only been the borders of the United States for 3 years of its history. There's 3 years of U.S. history where those are the borders, partly because in the 18th and early 19th century the United States was expanding, but because after it stopped sort of expanding in the contiguous North America, it started expanding overseas, taking first uninhabited islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific, and then taking large inhabited colonies. By the end of the 19th century, it had a very large and populous empire. And those overseas parts of the United States, both the colonies and then later on the military bases, hundreds of them that the United States claims, those I think, just don't really feature in most people's maps of the country. And as a result, they tell a truncated version of its history, a history that only is interested and only focuses on the mainland, and they miss a lot of the action when they do that.
And does it? And do we also? Does it have implications in terms of the character of the country? I mean, that we don't fully grasp the history, but do we not fully grasp? I guess I don't know. I'm just thinking, we're obviously it's primary season, and so we have a lot of candidates who talk about America as an idea, and I'm not sure I 100% know what that means. But does it implicate that idea?
I think it does, because the vision that you get of the United States, if you're just looking at what people in the territories call the mainland, first of all, it's a vision where Republican ideals hold not perfectly, but fairly well. Most people live in parts of the United States that allow them to vote, that allow them to have vote for representatives in Congress. Now, that's not true in D.C., so there are some little anomalies, and Native American lands have their own sort of legal arrangements. Nevertheless, you kind of feel like it's wall-to-wall carpeting in terms of the Republican system. Once you look at the other parts of the United States, the overseas parts, you realize that a big part of U.S. history is a peripheral zone, a zone that doesn't have representation in terms of the ability to vote for the president, doesn't have the ability to vote for delegates who then have voting power in Congress, and in many cases isn't even covered by the Constitution. So that's disenfranchisement or subordination by all three modes of government, and that is, I think, a serious cognitive dissonance or contradiction between the ideals of the country as we often articulate them and the ideals as they're actually lived.
I mean, I guess, and as we go through these sort of these eras, I mean, do we have an accounting of, particularly in that respect, of the numbers that we're talking about? I mean, how does that translate from at maybe high and low points in terms of just how many of those of people are in that sort of that area of they're not sovereign, but they're not in any way represented?
Sure. So we're at a relative low point right now. The United States still has 5 inhabited territories, and between 3 and 4 million people live in them. If you add Washington, D.C., that's a few more 100,000 people without full representation, the kind that citizens living in states have. But that's a relatively low point. If you go back to 1940. Which is where I sort of open the book as I tell the story of how World War II comes to the territories. At that time, 19 million people who live in the United States, 19 million people who are U.S. nationals, live off the mainland outside of the states. And just for some perspective, if you live in the United States, then there's a 1 in 8 chance that you're colonized, that you live in the territories, which means that you're more likely to be colonized than you are to be an immigrant. You're more likely to be colonized than you are to be African American by odds of 3 to 2. So this has been, at various points, a very substantial part of the United States' population. And even at times when, even in places where the populations are kind of low, small islands, military bases, which are relatively small enclaves, those spaces have also been really important to U.S. history beyond their effect of the people who live in them or right around them.
I want to start with Pearl Harbor and the story you tell about FDR and the way that he was sort of framing this for the estates. But it occurs to me as you're saying that about that sort of the really stunning number of people who are, disenfranchised is almost like an underwhelming word in that context. When we add that with slavery, where you had people obviously in probably material situations, perhaps even more oppressed, but certainly the number of we have had an expansive history of having dominion or control over people without their having any participation in what we perceive as the idea of America. That has been sort of more the norm than not.
Yeah, well, certainly it's been throughout U.S. history. Every day of U.S. history, there's some version of this going on. You can find some moment when the promises made turn out to be restricted to, in the 18th and 19th century, to a white settler population rather than to the full population of all the land in North America, which includes Native Americans, which includes enslaved African Americans. But what's really important to recognize, I think, is that colonialism is one of those important axes of subordination. Actually, it's a really big one. And so when we're talking about the ways in which people are disenfranchised or legally subordinated or sort of they don't count within the sort of sense of Washington of who matters and who doesn't, actually colonialism is a fairly big chunk of that, and certainly is so, especially in the first half of the 20th century.
So let's talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor, which in fact,
oh yeah, please.
Well, you may, I just found the whole thing sort of fascinating because I have always referred to it as the attack on Pearl Harbor, when in fact, in some respects, it was in terms of the war, it was not. It doesn't have the same relevance in terms of as all the other attacks that took place that day. But we don't have that in our consciousness because of I guess what the consciousness that Americans had of what constituted our territories at that time. Explain that.
Yeah, so Pearl Harbor is not really the best name for what happened. And the reason it's not the best name for what happened is that the attack began for the United States with an attack on the naval base Pearl Harbor in the territory of Hawaii, but it didn't stop there. In a near simultaneous attack, this all took place within hours. It's a little confusing because part of the attack took place on the other side of the international date line, and therefore it happened on December 8th, but this is all happening within a single solar day. The Japan attacks of the U.S. territories, Hawaii, Wake Island, which is an not indigenously inhabited but nevertheless occupied territory, Guam, and the single largest territory that the United States had ever held, which is the Philippines. And the reason that Pearl Harbor is not a particularly great descriptor for all of that is, first of all, it's not clear that that's even where the greatest military damage is done. The damage to the Philippines is quite serious and takes out the sort of pillar of air defense in the entire Pacific. But more importantly, the attack on Pearl Harbor is just an attack, whereas the attack on Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, and then later Alaska, this wasn't in that day, but it happened within months, was a Japanese attack, followed by more attacks, followed by invasion and occupation. And so, the largest colony that the United States had ever held, the Philippines, was occupied by Japan for years. It was a brutal occupation, and folks in the Philippines had a very different kind of war than people in Hawaii had.
In fact, by the end of World War II, Philippines had lost, what was it, 1.5 million people or
1.6. Okay, so it depends on how you count. If you're asking how many Filipinos died in the Second World War, the government count is around 1.1 million. If you ask how many people died in the Philippines, and that so includes Japanese and that includes U.S. mainland service members, then it goes up to 1.6 million. But just to clarify, that makes World War II in the Philippines the bloodiest event that ever took place on U.S. soil. That's 2 civil wars. And yet you rarely hear about this in U.S. history textbooks, because the kind of U.S. history that we often do and teach in this country is a history of not the entire United States. It's a history of the mainland only. And so things that take place outside of the mainland don't seem to count as part of that history.
And talk about how FDR addressed the country, the United States, I guess the Americans, in sort of framing what happened on that day. And I guess the question I have as you explain it is it simply because this is not a teachable moment to explain how we've been, how many territories we have? Or is it that this is not the vision that we have of ourselves, and so I don't want to really push that at this moment?
Yeah, so FDR faces a really interesting choice. And in fact, not just FDR. Anyone who's describing the attack that we now call Pearl Harbor, in those, hours and days after it, is facing an interesting question, which is how to describe what happened. And we've got a term for it, Pearl Harbor. But they didn't have that term. That was the name of the military base, the naval base. But no one called the full attack Pearl Harbor in the way that we did. That didn't come out for a few days. So you can just go through the newspaper headlines and see editors try to put a descriptor to it, or try to put a name to it, or try to say what happened. And often they would say that, well, a lot of things happened. Japan attacked Hawaii and Guam, or Japan attacked the Philippines and Hawaii. It wasn't clear where the focus needed to be. Eleanor Roosevelt gave a speech the night before, so before FDR's Date Which Will Live in Infamy speech, and she focused attention on Hawaii and the Philippines. And that's also how the draft of FDR's famous speech went. FDR produced that draft, and it was about Japanese attacks on Hawaii and the Philippines. And then you can just see FDR noodling with the draft. And when I say you can see it, I mean literally, because we actually have his marked up successive copies and his emendations and his deletions. And one thing he does is he takes out prominent references to the Philippines. He makes this a story about Hawaii. There's still a sort of back page reference to the Philippines. People don't always remember in that speech there, FDR gives a list of other places that Japan has attacked. It's an indiscriminate list, so it doesn't distinguish in any way between U.S. and foreign territory, and it's sort of tucked to the back of the speech. But nevertheless, the focus of that is on Hawaii, and it seems pretty clear to me why. I don't think this is a sort of grand conspiracy, but I think what FDR is responding to is that there is very little support on the U.S. mainland for a military defense of the Philippines, which has a very small white population, is very far from the mainland, or for Guam. And there's more support, although even that is kind of wobbly, to use the U.S. military to defend the territory of Hawaii, which has a larger, although not majority, white population. And you can see FDR worry about even Hawaii, because the final edit he makes to the speech between the last draft that we have on paper and his actual spoken speech is that he inserts the word American in there before he describes the target in Hawaii, just to really underscore to his audience, and I think FDR was nervous about what his audience would hear, that Hawaii might sound foreign, might feel foreign, but actually is American territory, and therefore a Japanese attack on it is a cause for war.
So, all right, so let's go back and what is the genesis of? I mean, I guess the genesis of the American Empire begins as I guess settlers and colonialists start to move west, right? What is the genesis of this sort of lack of awareness? I mean, and maybe this is like a generic shyness about being an empire, but it doesn't, it seems to me like the British Empire was sort of, they were pretty psyched about making sure that everybody was aware that they were an empire. I don't get the same, you don't get the same sense of American history in that way.
Yeah. So 2 things. First of all, you're right that in some ways these questions of empire go back to day one, literally to day one, in that right after the United States is formally independent from Britain, so the treaty has been ratified by both sides, and now the country is independent. Its name is United States of America, which suggests that it's a union of states, but it's not. It's a union of, or it's not even a union, it's an amalgam of states and territories. The word union suggests voluntarily entered into. But the United States, from day one, has territories, in this case Western territories, and will have territories every day, until now. I mean, so every intervening day, it's always states and territories. But at first, that's not a hidden kind of thing about the United States. People are very aware of it. The Civil War has a lot to do with the battle for slavery in the territories. Candidates for president will talk about their sort of, log cabin, backcountry roots. I think the moment when the imperial architecture of the United States becomes the kind of thing that has to be hidden is when those territories are no longer receptacles for the filling up with white settlers, when they become large populous places full of people who are perceived from the perspective of the mainland as non-white and who can't just be dislodged by white settlers. And so we're talking here about territories like Puerto Rico, Hawaii, the Philippines, Alaska, Guam, and that kind of imperialism, the kind about ruling distant populations, the kind that Britain does so proudly, that's the kind that the United States never sort of, or very rarely trumpets proudly, and for most of its history experiences a sort of cognitive dissonance about, on the one hand it has a vision of itself as, a republic where everyone has sort of some say in the government. On the other hand, the reality is that, millions of people live under this different kind of government, and that never quite fits in the same way that it fits easily into British political culture.
Is that what it is? It's because that reality butts up against the I guess the narrative of the character of America, of the idea of America, and is it that, and or is it also that this is about resource extraction or about some type of we need a base here?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that the story of the United States' overseas colonies is not largely a story of successful resource extraction. There are sugar plantations and pineapple plantations and such, but it's not like the United States depends for its absolute livelihood on its overseas territories. It does, in the later 20th century, start to care a lot about, all of its military bases all over the planet. But why does it have large colonies? It doesn't really turn out to need them in some deep way. Nevertheless, there's a real contradiction between how the United States, which was born of an anti-colonial revolt, envisions itself, the kind of pattern that it had been in the 19th century, where it did, states and territories, but it always, or it intended to upgrade those territories to states once they were filled with large white populations, and then the kind of pattern that, it acts out in the overseas territories, which doesn't quite fit that model, and therefore can't be part of the sort of, or doesn't turn out to be part of the national myths of the country.
I want to start going through the history, but I'm sort of hung up on so why was there so much of this? What did we?
Well, so much of what?
Of maintenance of territories when we don't need the resources. Was it we need the markets? Was it I mean, because I know we have some dynamics where it's it gives us a little it's almost like Guantanamo Bay on some level. That is a little bit extreme, but that's a model of what we use these territories for. It's outside of the purview of the United States, but we still have control, so we can experiment with some stuff and maybe do stuff that's quasi-legal, that type of thing.
Well, so Guantanamo Bay is a pretty good example of this because, now we think of Guantanamo Bay as, for the perspective of, the United States and the national security apparatus, it has been a very useful space. It's this little part of Cuba that the United States has exclusive jurisdiction over, and jurisdiction that is so complete it's as if it were a sovereign, but it's not a sovereign. And that difference between not quite technically being a sovereign is what allows all kinds of legal things to happen, or things that would be illegal if they were happening on U.S. soil. So you think of that as a very useful kind of space, but you have to realize that the United States had Guantanamo Bay since the very early 20th century. And, sometimes it had been genuinely really useful. Other times it had been a little less so. And there's a kind of history of experimentation. What can be done with it? Haitians who are, coming to the U.S. mainland can be detained there. That's something that happens before it gets its present-day use. And I think a lot of the history of the U.S. colonial empire, as opposed to the history of the pointillist empire and the military bases, is a history of speculative desires. But desires that don't always pan out. So there's this great enthusiasm at the end of the 19th century for the United States becoming a big colonial empire, for having Hawaii and the Philippines, and these will be, highways to Asia and to trade with Japan and China. And that trade doesn't really become a huge thing. But nevertheless, in the same way that you can, a couple can fall out of love but stay married, a country can grow less imperialist or sort of lose its initial imperialist desire and remain an empire. And I think that's the history of the U.S. colonies, at least in the early 20th century. They do have some kinds of uses for Washington, but they are not the most useful parts of the country. Nevertheless, they're still part of it, and a part of the country that is neglected, that lives in the shadows. Well, that could be a very weird part of the country to occupy.
Tell us a little bit how, like, the Guano Islands fall into that, and that notion of appertaining, which I found fascinating.
Yeah. So what happens is there's an agricultural crisis in the United States in the mid-19th century, and the reason it's happening is kind of fairly predictable. Is that if you grow food on a farm, again, you grow a cash crop. So it could be grain, it could be cotton, it could be tobacco. But if you grow it again and again on the same plot of land and you keep selling it somewhere else rather than consuming it nearby or consuming it on the land and then depositing the nutrients back in the lands through feces or just, by putting the waste back on the lands, you end up depleting the soil. And particularly, you start running down the soil's nitrates, which are kind of hard to restore if you just keep, doing that year after year. So farmers get really nervous about finding some way to replenish their parched farms, and the thing that does it is guano, which is, but guano can mean bird or bat feces used for fertilizer, but it turns out that this is the droppings of seabirds on these small dry islands that don't see a lot of rain, where the birds just land and they eat their anchovies and they land on the islands and then they defecate on the islands, and then it just just keeps piling up for years, centuries, millennia, drying in the sun. That stuff is a really useful fertilizer. And so in the middle of the 19th century, this is actually the first U.S. overseas expansion, the United States lays claim to nearly 100 uninhabited guano islands and annexes them to the United States. And there's a Guano Island Act that's passed, and it says that these places will be, once they're sort of claimed and the claim is ratified, they'll be appertaining to the United States, which is a kind of a weird sort of language, but what it seems to say is that they're fully part of the United States. Now, that phrase, appertaining to the United States, that's the legal foundation for the United States' overseas empire. That's the first time that the United States had annexed overseas territory. And there's a Supreme Court case about whether appertaining really, does that mean that these places are really part of the United States or not? And the Supreme Court decides yes. So it's these are just 100 small uninhabited islands. They're quickly scraped free of guano, and then after that, they're not as useful anymore. But nevertheless, they are the actual legal foundations for a much larger populous empire. One that includes up to 19 million people by the eve of World War II.
It's an amazing metaphor that our entire empire, the project of the empire, is literally built on mountains of crap. But
yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I'll just say one other thing, because we talked about the ways in which these places can be useful and then not have an obvious use from the perspective of Washington, but sort of develop one a little later. Those Guano Islands, after the guano is scraped off of them, they sort of fall into disrepair or disuse. But then it turns out in the mid-20th century, for all of the reasons that they're interesting to birds as places to land, they're also really useful for places for airplanes to land. And then suddenly the Guano Islands become absolute, or at least some of them become absolutely essential to the U.S. military strategy. And it is with the Guano Islands that the United States fights World War II in the Pacific.
Interesting. And let's move to the early 1900s when the Supreme Court does sort of make a distinction between incorporated and unincorporated territories. What were the implications of that, and how much staying power did that have?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting moment. So the United States has just acquired a number of populated territories. It's gutted Spain's empire in a war, and it's also taken Hawaii and American Samoa. And then there's this legal question of, well, what are these places? Are they part of the United States? And if so, how much are they part of the United States? Are people who live in them automatically citizens? There's a law. It's called the 14th Amendment that says if you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. Does that apply to Filipinos? Does the Bill of Rights apply to Filipinos? So the Supreme Court argues it, and it's a contested thing. It's a very public thing. These arguments, and ultimately, what the Supreme Court decides is that there is a distinction, and this is a novel distinction. It wasn't one that had been around before, but the Supreme Court introduces it. There's a distinction between incorporated territories. Those territories are part of the United States in a constitutional sense. So those are the old Western territories, and they're also the two overseas territories that have the largest white populations, Hawaii, and the Supreme Court decides Alaska. But all of the territories that the United States had claimed from Spain, which is where most of its colonial subjects live, those, the Supreme Court decides, are unincorporated territories, which means that they are part of the United States, but they're not part of the United States that's covered by the Constitution. And so that's why, even today, you can be born in American Samoa. You're born in the United States. No one disputes that. You have a U.S. passport. The stars and stripes fly overhead. But nevertheless, your U.S. passport does not say you're a U.S. citizen because the 14th Amendment doesn't extend to you. You're a U.S. national instead.
I mean, to put it in context, this is the same Supreme Court that basically said literacy laws for voting were okay and poll taxes were okay. I mean, the agenda is pretty clear, right?
Yeah, and it's actually nearly identical to the court. I mean, there's, I think, one member different that decides the first of these cases. They're called the insular cases. That also decides Plessy v. Ferguson, which is the case that enshrines separate but equal as a constitutional way of running the country, which administratively divides the country into two in terms of white and non-white. The insular cases do something similar. They divide the country into two in terms of a constitutional zone and an extra-constitutional zone, and they also do it appealing to exactly the same logic. Who's really part of the country and who's, for racial reasons, not quite really part of the country. The difference is this. Plessy v. Ferguson, I mean, that's recognized today as one of the sort of worst mistakes in the court's history, and it's been overturned. The insular cases are still good law.
Yeah, well, I mean, Plessy v. Ferguson, we could be just a couple of years away from that type of regime returning in some respects. Maybe I'm overstating the case, maybe a little bit, but certainly the Lochner era may be back soon. But with that said, so this law, so how is it that? Well, I mean, I guess it's quite obvious why it's so durable, right? Is because why has that been so durable? I guess is really what I'm asking. Why? What were the forces that didn't allow Plessy v. Ferguson to stand, but allowed this to stand?
Yeah, I think one difference is that the Jim Crow was obviously a form of racist subordination, but it was also fairly public. It was hard to not know that the country had a Jim Crow system if you were living anywhere in the country in the 20th century. Nevertheless, it's been very easy not to really understand the colonial system or even the fact of overseas territories if you live in the mainland part of the United States or if you have lived there in the 20th and into the 21st century. So an example of this is even after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and laid waste to the infrastructure of the island, there was and it made all the headlines. There was a national poll that asked people in the mainland, are Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens? And barely a majority of people, adults polled, were able to correctly say, yes, Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And if you asked adults under 30, only 37% of them were able to cough up that number. So I think one difference between the racist regime that had applied to African Americans is it was very much in the public view, whereas the colonial forms of subordination and segregation, those have kind of happened off stage, at least off stage from the perspective of the mainland.
Since we're talking about Puerto Rico, tell us the story of Cornelius Rhodes, because that is, we've talked on this program, that of the long history that the United States has had, that in many respects is really one of, almost waging some type of war against Puerto Rico in one form or another. And Cornelius Rhodes, I think, sort of exemplifies that a little bit.
Yeah, so I said that the overseas parts of the United States are often off stage from the perspective of the mainland, and what's important to grasp is that all kinds of things can happen off stage that couldn't happen under the glare of the spotlights, and the Cornelius Rhodes story is a great example of that. So Cornelius Rhodes is a doctor. He's Harvard trained. He's from the mainland, but he goes to San Juan. He goes to Puerto Rico, and he goes there to study anemia, a condition from which many Puerto Ricans suffer. And so what does he do? Well, suddenly, when he hits the island, he just becomes a very different kind of doctor. So first of all, he intentionally refuses treatment to some of his patients just to see what will happen. He tries to induce disease in other of his patients also to see what will happen. He describes patients such as this to his colleagues as experimental animals. And then he writes a letter. He writes one of the most extraordinary letters that I've read as a historian, where he writes to a Boston colleague, and he, starts off, it's a very chatty letter, and he said, how are you? Hope everyone's well. Here's some gossip about the field. And then he says, oh, and me, Puerto Rico, I'm in Puerto Rico. It's beautiful. The island is great. The only problem is the Puerto Ricans. They're awful. They're filthy. They steal. Frankly, they're the worst. And the best thing for Puerto Rico, he goes on to say, would be a total extermination of the population. And then he says, in fact, I've started it. I have killed 8 of my patients, and I've tried to transplant cancer. Turns out it's very hard to transplant cancer, but he doesn't know that. I've tried to transplant cancer into 13 others. Hope your wife's well, all best. And it's an incredible letter, right? Because he just it seems like he's confessed to murdering 8 people. And extraordinarily, the letter gets found by the Puerto Rican hospital staff, and it becomes a major scandal in Puerto Rico. Of course it does. There's an investigation by the government. That investigation uncovers yet another letter, which the governor describes as worse than the first, which is kind of impossible to imagine for me. But nevertheless, the government destroys that second letter, so we've never seen it as historians, and concludes that he wasn't really serious about what he said. He didn't really kill 8 people. And extraordinarily, Cornelius Rhodes is able to just leave. He doesn't face any kind of trial. He doesn't even lose his job. He just goes back to the mainland. What happens in San Juan stays in San Juan, and then his medical career takes off. Now, it does. I mean, what's amazing about the story is that in itself would be incredible, but it doesn't end because as his medical career takes off, he becomes the vice president of the New York Academy of Medicine. He goes into the Army, and while he's in the Army, he oversees he's the chief medical officer in a large-scale series of tests of chemical weapons on U.S. service members. So U.S. service members have toxic agents applied to their skin to see what happens. Many of them suffer permanent damage. They're put in gas chambers with gas masks to see what will happen. Some of them are put out in jungles and told to fight while they're gassed from overhead. A lot of those people are also Puerto Rican, and Cornelius Rhodes is right there in the middle of it, writing up reports. Does black skin blister differently than white skin? Cornelius Rhodes will let you know. He gets a medal for this. And then as a result of those experiments, one of the things they figure out is that some of these toxic agents are actually good at fighting cancer, and Cornelius Rhodes uses that to become, in the third phase of his career, the first head of the Sloan Kettering Institute, and basically one of the pioneers of chemotherapy. And that's what he's remembered for decades on the U.S. mainland, as a medical hero, the father of chemotherapy. And it really takes an extraordinarily long time before Puerto Ricans are able to get the message out that this guy who's been on the cover of Time magazine as a hero is actually the sort of like Mengele of Puerto Rico. And I mean, for me, that's kind of that's the final extraordinary bit, is that the informational segregation is so tight that it takes decades for Puerto Ricans to effectively, do something about the fact that Cornelius Rhoads is being openly celebrated as a hero on the mainland, and the people who are celebrating him have no idea what he was up to in Puerto Rico.
That story is just so nuts, man. But it
really is.
It does capture. I mean, it's almost the perfect metaphor in some respects, right? I mean, that is the extraction or the oppression ends up, fueling on some level at different times the expansion and the success of the country in some fashion. And then, we don't have too much time left here, but the nature of the empire changes to being less colonial and in many respects more like would you call it? Sort of via influence, or I mean, maybe the Hoover screws story sort of is a good metaphor for this.
Yeah, so I think there are two things that happen. As the United States, gets through World War II, it becomes the most powerful country in the world. And it has the option militarily. I mean, it physically can do this. It has the option of doing what Britain had done, which is expressing its power by taking a lot of colonies and controlling a lot of the land of the planet. Right at the end of World War II, the United States actually has, in occupied zones mainly, and in colonies, which is a slightly lesser number, it has more people who are under U.S. jurisdiction, who are living outside of the mainland than who are living in all of the states. I mean, that's how much land the United States briefly controls at the end of World War II. And so then it faces an interesting question. Is it want to be Britain again? Does it want to sort of do that whole thing and claim colonies and annex Japan and all that kind of stuff? And it doesn't. And it still has a colonial empire. There are still 5 inhabited territories of the United States today, and millions of people live in them. But nevertheless, the United States sort of pivots away. One thing it does is it seeks to find ways to influence outside of its borders, to extend its and project power, not by extending its borders, by annexing new places, but by controlling processes in foreign countries. But undergirding that, and this is what I focus on particularly, is that the United States does this not by abjuring territory entirely, but by claiming just a bunch of small territorial points. And by a bunch, I mean literally hundreds. That's the number of foreign military bases that the United States has. But these points act as sort of staging grounds and beacons and just little sort of connectors that allow the United States to spread a much more diffuse influence out throughout the world, which is still undergirded by some sort of territorial component, but a territorial footprint that I think looks more pointillist than colonial.
I mean, it's almost like the web, like a series of servers. We have something like nearly 800 bases across the country. I mean, across the world.
Yeah, it's a network,
right? And how does that? Is the influence there exclusively? Is it projecting power from a military standpoint? Like these are, we have the high ground in these 800 places, or we have control of, it need be, the harbor, or is it also a cultural one too?
Yes. What I think is so interesting about the bases is that their purpose is military. That's what they're there for. That's why we call them military bases. But that's not all they do, because you have to imagine these places as little, or in some cases actually not so little, enclaves that are full of people from the United States. And there's all kind of interesting contacts between people on the base, often who have quite a lot of money compared to the surrounding region, and the people around it. So in the book, I tell the story about the complicated interactions that people who are on base have with folks who are living in the shadow of the bases. And it actually becomes a really important vector for the spread of U.S. culture. So one of the questions I take up in my book is, why does Liverpool become this sort of world city of pop? Like, why is there so much? We know about the Beatles, but the bench is like 500 bands deep. There's a lot of bands that like were pointed in the direction of the Beatles. We're doing that kind of music, and they're all coming out of the Liverpool area. And why is that? Because Liverpool hadn't habitually been the major city for pop music in Britain. And the answer is that, Liverpool is in the shadow of the single largest U.S. Air Force base in Europe, this base called Burtonwood. And it's really clear that not just the Beatles, but all these other bands are kind of subsisting on, these guys in the base who are very rich, who are going out into the clubs at night, who are demanding U.S.-style rock, and Ringo's stepdad works on the bass, makes his money there, and gets all these records as a result of working there that he gives to Ringo. John's mom is what's called a good time girl, so I imagine she's spending some time with the guys from the basses. She also has an incredibly up-to-date record collection, and that's how Paul gets his records too. And George sort of steals them from the local record shop, which is also bristling with all kinds of like really good, what they then called race records, which are African American records of African American music, and all of that's coming from the portal of the base, where there's just all this money, there's all this glamour, and there are all these guys sort of, waiting to spread it around for willing young teenagers who can play U.S.-style rock. So it's not entirely a surprise that the Liverpool area becomes an area sort of where rock takes off, because these bases are, in some ways little just portals of the United States, and little portals not just of U.S. military power, but of U.S. Industrial standards and culture and all language and all these other things that come with the United States that seep through the portal as well.
Well, it's fascinating stuff. I wish we had more time to get to the standardization of screws, which I found fascinating. And longtime listeners of this program will remember the story of the Northern Mariana Islands and Jack Abramoff and Tom DeLay, and how they would visit that in the mid-aughts as a way of basically getting made in USA goods by basically near slave labor, practically. But there's a lot more in here. How to Hide an Empire, A History of the Greater United States. Daniel Immerwahr, thank you so much for your time today. We will put a link at majority.fm of your book.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure to be on.
All right, folks.
This is Max. I'm calling in from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Max from Minneapolis, Minnesota. What's on your mind, Max?
Well, a lot of things right now, actually. I think I emailed you guys the other night. I said I was asking about whether or not you guys still did the whole debate, what was it, Libertarian Anarchocapitalist thing.
Sure. So what do you got?
Whatever you got to throw at me. People have asked me why I'm an anarcho-capitalist, why I think this is a good ideology, why I like it so much.
Okay. Can I just say before you start, you cannot have both of our words at once. You have to choose one. Either you're going to take anarchist or libertarian from us, from the far left, I mean.
No, you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can explain to us now. All right, so... okay, so why don't you explain to us what these are? What is a libertarian anarcho-capitalist?
Well, it's where somebody is allowed to have the freedom of the state to whatever means necessary, and someone can just basically do whatever they want in a organized boundary where they're not allowed to let anybody in or anybody out without any sort of regulation.
Okay, what's the who's going to organize these boundaries?
The hierarchical society.
And how is that hierarchical society that is stateless now? How is that going to work?
Well, it's capitalist. It's one of the few things carried over from a capitalist society.
So the one thing that so what you imagine is that basically our leaders will be the richest people in the country, and they will organize things for us.
That's what capitalism is. It's anarchy, wherein people are allowed to buy whatever they want at whatever asking price they are asking for. It's basically a haggling system, as you can have in, say, the diasporas or the cities in Israel. When I went there, it was you would say, I want
in the shuk.
Yes, like that. The markets, the bazaars. When you would go there, you could ask, they would ask 500 shekels for a soccer jersey, and you could say, well, I want to pay 350, and you could start haggling from there. You could say, well, you could say 475 for like 450.
No, I understand. I understand how haggling works. No, so wait a second. So in the society you imagine, Max, what if the richest person, right? Let's say, because as we transition into your version of the society, right? Like the capitalists who have all the money, they're going to be the ones who organize everything, correct? As you said, they're going to be the organizers because this is the hierarchical society that you're talking about. What if they say like, hey, guys, I have $1 billion. Guess what? I just bought the shuk. And all you little guys, bye-bye. And now Max goes in to bargain with this one owner, and he says, I want that soccer jersey. And the guy says, 500 shekels. And Max says, I want to pay 300 shekels. And the guy says, all right, goodbye. Good luck buying it somewhere else because we've cornered the whole thing.
Well, then I could just buy it somewhere else. It's not.
No, Max, I just said they've bought it all up. They've bought out every other little stall that's there. Those little tiny stalls, they couldn't compete with this billionaire. So where do you get the shirt now, Max?
You buy it anywhere else, I guess.
Well, I just told you there's no other stores. He's got a monopoly. Max?
You
still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
So, dude, what do you do?
I'm just listening to the people in the background. What's up?
Well, those guys.
You have a wonderful day, bro, and I'll see you again soon.
No. Forgive Michael, please. He is rude.
I got something in my eye. It has nothing to do with this.
Listen,
I'm not listening. Believe me.
Max, I'm asking you, what do you do now?
Well, I could either revolt. I could shut down his market. I could try.
How are you going to shut down his
over,
market? He's got $1 billion. You got what? $150? You got the 300 shekels?
Throw it. That's the beauty of an anarchistic society. I could throw it over.
Stop using our word that's not your word.
Wait a second. How would you throw over that?
Oh my. What do you mean? Oh my God. Anarchistic is not like. You're saying hold on. You're claiming anarchy as a word.
No. All right, listen, don't get distracted by that. Don't get distracted.
No. You can't just claim a word like that. This isn't like.
You're right. You're right. She cannot. I agree. Now let's get back to the scenario we were talking about. Let's say, like, how would you overthrow, let's say, Bloomberg News?
Just assassinate the guy.
Oh, okay. I understand that. I understand what you're saying now. So this is going to lead in your anarcho-capitalist world. The way it's going to work is monopolies and then assassinations.
Yeah.
All right. Cool world, man. Do we get jetpacks?
No.
I didn't think so. All right, buddy. I appreciate the call. Thank you.
Such appropriation. It's really triggering for me. All right. Remember, folks, and caps or whatever you want to call yourselves. It's a culture, not a costume.
This is not beanbag.
Anarchists oppose hierarchy. The more you know.
Stop it. Knock it off.
I mean, I listen. By the way, no, to be fair, can I just say, most legit answer to that question I've ever heard.
Right.
I mean, everybody else is just like, I asked them, they want to meet. We could have a free exchange of ideas. Assassinate them. Okay.
I will say,
it's not what I want, but that was by far
also
the most intelligent answer I've heard to that question.
And that's why I had to basically wrap up the conversation because I really don't have a response to someone who is suggesting we can develop a political system that would be based on monopolies that would be dealt with by assassination. I mean, that is, I can't really argue.
You're cornered.
Right.
You're cornered.
It's like agree to disagree on what kind of world you want.
Exactly. If we're not
500 shekels, eh? Watch your back at the souk.
Oh, shoot.
It's hard to argue when you can't agree on the basic terms.
Less concerned about the direction of the conversation, it would have been really like, how do you go about organizing the assassinations when all of the private death squads are owned by the same billionaires?
Well, I'll tell you how you do that.
How do you get to the assassinations when there are no roads?
Nice.
That's how you do it. You get Bourne to do it.
Wait, so then Jason Bourne is operating as some type of like social service worker for people that aren't billionaires. That doesn't sound very capitalist.
Exactly. He is the one. That's the one thing you need is the pro bono social services top assassin spy.
So then they can see, like, I will concede, even though I'm a libertarian, we need a government provision for one thing, which is a Jason Bourne style assassination
squad. Sort of like the Jedi, but not so futuristic.
It sounds lit.
That's actually pretty awesome, dude. That was the best libertarian call I've ever had. Respect.
There you go. So apparently there's this pastor, Kenneth Copeland. He's a megachurch pastor. Why would Inside Edition be interested in this? Well, apparently Kenneth Copeland, who did he buy his plane from? He bought his plane from Tyler Perry, which is I don't know. If you're worried about demons, apparently the preacher said, someone asked him about it. He said, I'm not getting on board one of those metal tubes with all the little devils in it. And you'll see in this sort of interview, if you will, he explains it's not humans I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual devil spirits. I would be worried about getting into Tyler Perry's plane.
Can you imagine getting on a private jet with this guy?
Yeah, no.
He's not talking about white devils, that's for sure.
Oh, there you go. All right, so here is megachurch pastor Kenneth Copeland being interviewed by a Inside Edition reporter.
Isn't it true that you want to fly commercial so that you can fly in luxury? How much money did you pay for Tyler Perry's Gulfstream jet, for example?
Well, for example, that's really none of your business, but...
Isn't it the business of your donors?
Listen, I paid. You kind of caught me off guard here, okay? Thank you, Lord. Help me. Let me pray.
Well, let me just ask you a really simple question. A lot of people think it's unbecoming for a preacher to live a life of luxury and to fly around in private jets. What's your response to that?
Very simple. It takes a lot of money to do what we do. Without the airplane that we have that I bought from Tyler Perry, and I didn't pay anywhere, and Tyler's one of the greatest guys. He made that airplane so cheap for me, I couldn't help but buy it.
Well, my question then, okay, all right, but I want to get to the demons, because people are very concerned about that comment.
Give me a chance here, Inside Edition. I love your eyes.
Again, getting back to the comment. You said that you don't like to fly commercial because you don't want to get into a tube with a bunch of demons. Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did. We wrestle not with flesh and blood, but principalities and powers.
Can you explain what you meant by that term then? Just explain, because it's really simple. You said you didn't want to get into a tube with a bunch of demons. What did you mean? Do you think that people that fly commercial are demons?
If you give me a chance to talk, sweetheart, I'll explain this to you. But it's a biblical thing. It's a spiritual thing. It doesn't have anything to do with people. People, I love people. Jesus loves people.
Jesus
but
does.
People get pushed in alcohol. Do you think that's a good place for a preacher to be and prepare to go preach to a lot of people? when somebody in there is dragging some woman down an aisle. It made me so mad to see that on television. I wanted to punch the guy out myself. I can't be doing that while I'm getting ready to preach.
So you just don't like to be around the sinful people or the hurtful people. Is that what you're saying?
Not the people, baby. Not the people.
God.
To those critics that say that a preacher should not be living a life of luxury, what is your response to that?
They're wrong.
That's it? The Bible also says that it's more difficult for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a camel to get through the eye of a needle, correct?
The rest of the scripture. But he said, all things are possible with God.
Boom. There you go.
Owned.
I love it when he goes, oh, but that's not right, baby. He's calling her baby like that's...
I like your ass.
Oh, my God.
That is so creepy.
How many like inappropriate,
He's trying to shut her up.
I mean, aside from just the horror that those type of people are, just broadly speaking, how many do you think like inappropriate sort of come-ons he's been involved in? Like how many? Like God,
seems like a lot.
I felt very grateful that she had the door between him and her.
But I will say this: what I would like to see Inside Edition, the business they get into, is why stop with preachers? Like, why is there really a fundamental difference that it's hypocritical for a man of God to amass that kind of money when it's okay for Howard Schultz to?
Well, I mean, Howard Schultz doesn't claim to be super into Jesus, does he?
Well, he's Jewish.
All right, so like there is a certain hypocrisy, and
I think that's probably true. But I still think that like sometimes I sort of feel like those type of things get to be a little bit like they're a little bit distracting. That's the only thing I'm saying.
Fair enough.
Going after religion?
Nobody should have a private jet.
I think private jets are a problem.
Yeah, we should ban private jets. It'd be great.
Fly with demons the way the rest of us do.
Demon Airlines.
You think you're too good to fly with demons?
We all think we fly with demons. We know that.
Yeah, no.
I don't know. The way you talked about that offer of the private jet, are we sure Tyler Perry isn't like a discount private jet salesman?
It was so cheap. I had to buy
I had to buy it for the church.
My God. I'm going to flip it. I'm going to flip it.
It's only $250,000. I'm not going to
I got news for you. That jet was probably a little more than $250,000.
Well, I'm going to start an airline called Demon Air, and all of the goth socialists who, listen to my show are going to fly on it. It's going to be great.
I'm going to start a religion.
Speaking of... meanwhile, on the Hill yesterday, the House Judiciary Committee heard testimony from former White House counsel John Dean, who was obviously Richard Nixon's White House counsel, went on to write extensively about Nixon and about authoritarians in our government. That was 10, 15 years ago. He saw that the Republican Party was actually turning authoritarian. Saw the indications of that happening. And he's been, brought on various capacities as a commentator. I'm not sure I fully get why. I understand the sort of the thinking, but it really is one-dimensional thinking and too clever by half, I think, by the Democrats to do this. But it may be the best that they could do with Nancy Pelosi, and we will talk about Nancy Pelosi. We have that clip of her at P. Peterson. Right? Oh, God. Anyways, so in lieu of impeachment hearings, we're getting this, which is apparently just to set the table. Now, of course, it did create some attention, and wherever there's attention, there is milkshake Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz loves a a slushie on a hot Florida day. He is from the Florida Panhandle. And here he is questioning John Dean. He doesn't do a terribly good job, but he does get humiliated. And how do we know that Matt Gaetz felt he got humiliated? I will tell you after the clip.
Do you have personal knowledge regarding the truth or falsity of a single material fact in the Mueller report?
I think if you recall the first thing I said, I'm not here as a fact witness.
You're here to provide historical context.
Exactly.
And throughout history, you accuse presidents of acting like Richard Nixon, and you make money off of it, right?
Not all presidents, no.
No, but a few more than one.
Those who do act like him, I pointed out.
Let me ask you this question. How do Democrats plan to pay for Medicare for all?
I'm sorry?
Well, I figured if we were going to ask you about stuff you don't know about, we'd start with the big stuff. So do you know how they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats, or which candidate, or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. Do you believe?
Well, actually, Nixon did have a health care plan.
Good. Well, do you believe if we turned the lights off here and maybe lit some candles, got out a Ouija board, we could potentially raise the specter of Richard Nixon?
I doubt that.
Well,
So now,
sounded much better in front of the mirror, Matt.
Right, Matt Gaetz thought he was. Yeah, and basically, he tried like 3 or 4 different tacks. I'm going to go to this. John Dean may actually know how these candidates are going to pay for their health care, and I certainly don't want that to happen. So let's talk about Nixon. Oh, Nixon had a health care. And they all laughed at Matt Gaetz. And what's even more important than my assessment that they all laughed at Matt Gaetz is Matt Gaetz's assessment that they laughed at Matt Gaetz. And how do I know that Matt Gaetz felt they all laughed at him? Because there is no intern in Matt Gaetz's office who would have made the decision on their own to edit that video and release it and hide the fact that John Dean owned Matt Gaetz in this exchange. Here is the video that has been put out by Matt Gaetz. This is eerie, folks. Eerie. 50,000 people have watched this, and they're missing the part where Matt Gaetz gets metaphorically slushied.
How they plan to pay for Medicare for all?
Who? The Democrats, or which candidate, or can you be more specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off here and maybe lit some candles, got out a Ouija board, we could potentially raise the specter of Richard Nixon.
There you go. They cut out that whole moment.
They made it sound as if people were chuckling at his weak joke.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because they got the tail end of the laughter. Here's the part again.
Appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off here...
Specific?
Let's get specific to Nixon, since that appears to be why you're here. If we turned the lights off...
Yeah. Orwellian, man.
Let's get specific to skipping me humiliating myself in a spectacular fashion.
Calling Vic Berger...
I'm worried that...
forget Vic Berger. This should be all over the news in Florida. I mean, that is pretty stunning that he would edit it that way.
Doctor in the public record.
Yeah, it really is. And there's 50,000 people who watched his version already. 50,000 people, and you can bet a lot of those are his constituents.